This is the video lecture for Chapter 6. It's the last video lecture before you take your Unit 1 assessment. So let's go. Alright, after this chapter, you should be able to answer questions about the way the human body uses energy. You should be able to answer questions about aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, also called fermentation. Your book talks about human weight and the obesity epidemics, but that's frankly an easy one to answer. We have more access to food and fewer physical restraints today than we had throughout most of our evolution, so we're like super efficient at storing our food. Easy. I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to move on to more interesting topics. You should remember from Chapter 4 last week that food energy is potential chemical energy stored in organic macromolecules in our food. So we have carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Remember that lipids have the most energy in them, the most calories. We're going to learn exactly why today. And remember also that we're talking about food calories, which have a capital C, and 1 food calorie is equivalent to 1,000 of the little c calories. Remember too that not everyone uses calories in the same way. So things like gender and muscle mass and age all affect your requirements for calories. Not every day you're going to eat this exact right number of calories for what you're doing. Maybe you're hiking, maybe you're on the couch, and maybe you're just aging and you need different caloric requirements as you age. You don't eat the right amount every single day. You just don't. Most days you don't, I'm sure. Because of that, we need to be able to store our excess calories, and that's a big part of the topic for today. Plants and animals both need to store their energy, and they do it very similarly. Both have carbohydrate and lipid storage molecules. So we're going to look at these. In plants, their primary carbohydrate for storage is starch. Starch is just a straight chain of monosaccharides. It's just a bunch of glucose molecules linked together. They also store energy in lipids, just like animals do, but in plants it's liquid droplets, it's oil, and the molecule for that is something called triacylglycerols versus animals, which is a little bit different. And these oils are usually stored in propagules or seeds or nuts, so olive oil, peanut oil, these things. In animals, our carbohydrate storage molecule is something called glycogen, and it's similar to starch. It's monosaccharides, but instead of being a straight chain, it's a highly branched molecule. So it's not quite as neat and tidy, but it works very well for us. We also, of course, store lipids. I'm sure you're all aware of this in a molecule, or in a molecule called triglycerides. And remember, these aren't repeated monomers so much. It's just what happens when you break down lipids. So we store this as fat, and we have specialized cells, fat cells, or adipose sites. Adipose means fat, and those are very, very important for our survival. Once we are ready to use our stored energy, whatever it is that we're doing, we're exercising more or we're eating less, so we need those stored calories, we have to convert it to glucose if it isn't already in that form. So remember that lipids and proteins also provide us with energy. These usually have to go through a few extra steps to get into the form of glucose. Most cells need energy from the glucose molecule. There are a lot of cells as well, like neurons in your nerves or your brain, that can only use glucose. They cannot use an amino acid directly. It has to be changed first. These are usually changed in the liver, actually, either from glycogen being converted to glucose, either in the liver, or it can happen directly in muscle cells, or in the case of fat, those triglycerides are transported to the liver where they can be converted into glucose and then re-disseminated back to whichever cells need them. Anyways, once you have glucose, it enters the cell. We're going to go through this in details, but it's split into two other molecules. This is a process called glycolysis. Once it's split, and that's what that word means, glycolysis means, lysis means splitting, and so splitting glucose, glyco means sugar. Once that happens, one of two processes can happen. The split molecules can enter the mitochondria and undergo aerobic respiration, or if there's no oxygen, which we'll see, they can be broken down in a different process called anaerobic respiration or fermentation. Either way, the purpose of all of this is to produce something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. This ATP is the go-to molecule for cellular energy. Glucose really is too big. If you're trying to power a cellular function like producing a protein or pumping potassium ions across a membrane or something, there is just too much energy in a glucose molecule to do that efficiently. So instead, we use it to produce ATP, which looks like this. So ATP, like I said, it's adenosine triphosphate. It's because there's this adenine right here that is the exact same nitrogenous base found in our DNA, which we're going to see next unit a little bit more. That's an important thing right there. There's also ribose, which is a type of sugar, and these three phosphate groups right here. These guys are very important. That's kind of where we store smaller amounts of energy for cellular functions. Your book has some pretty darn decent diagrams here to show aerobic respiration, so I'm going to just go ahead and use those. For this first one, we're going to get just kind of an overview. So, carbohydrates in your food are catabolized down to glucose in the intestines. Or this glucose can also come, like I said, from your liver, which would break down those storage molecules into glucose, put it back in the bloodstream, and it can get to whichever cells are needing the energy. This glucose goes from the bloodstream in either of these processes into the cytoplasm of the cell through membrane proteins. This has to happen through active transport because glucose is too big to pass right through the lipid bilayer. If you remember all that stuff from chapter 3, you can think of this as, it takes money to make money. It takes a little bit of energy to get that glucose in there and get more energy from it. Once the glucose is in the cytoplasm, it gets split, which we'll look at next time, and then those smaller molecules that are split from glucose enter the mitochondria. It goes through all these processes in here that we're going to look at, and then what ends up happening is this requires oxygen. So this oxygen here also comes in through the bloodstream, through your lungs, because you breathe it in, enters the cell, enters the mitochondria, and performs a very important function. From this, we get some byproducts. We get carbon dioxide, enters back into the bloodstream, goes to your lungs, you just breathe it out. Your water also leaves the cell. I would rather they drew this arrow going like this because it also enters your bloodstream to leave your body. And you also get ATP, this energy molecule. Notice that this overall chemical formula here is basically the reverse of photosynthesis. If you just stick this arrow going the other way, you've got water, which plants uptake through their roots, carbon dioxide, and energy. In that case, in the case of photosynthesis, it would be solar light energy, but some energy. What you get out of it is oxygen and glucose. It's the opposite of photosynthesis. Okay. Now, let's go in a little bit closer to see some details here. So this glycolysis reaction happens in the cytoplasm right here. So you'd get glucose You break it down into two smaller molecules, each of 3 carbons. They're called pyruvate, or sometimes you'll hear it called pyruvic acid. It's the same thing. That's glycolysis. It happens in the cytoplasm, and you get 2 ATP molecules from it. It's not bad. Something that I want to point out is that this pyruvate, just like glucose, it's made of carbon, some C's, some H's, hydrogen, and also oxygen. Each pyruvate is 3 carbons and then various amounts of hydrogen and oxygen. They're not quite exactly the same if I remember right, but that doesn't matter. Just remember what they're made of. These pyruvate molecules are smaller now. They're able to enter the mitochondria, and they go through something called the citric acid cycle. I don't care if you know a whole lot of details about this citric acid cycle, but the point is you see these electrons being cycled through here. Those are very important. Those electrons are stripped from the pyruvate, and then they're carried by this molecule right here. They're carried by hydrogen and stuck onto NAD plus to produce NADH. That's very similar to the NADPH in photosynthesis. It's just kind of a reminder that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once independent organisms which had independently evolved the ability to transport electrons in some pretty actually similar molecules. Not quite the same, but close. Once the electrons are stripped from pyruvate, carbon dioxide and oxygen are released just as waste. They go back into the bloodstream and they are carried to your lungs and you breathe out carbon dioxide. From this you also get 2 ATP molecules, not bad. But the big thing are these electrons, which again are carried by hydrogen. So here's the carbon and the oxygen. Oh, it's a C and an O. They're released here. The hydrogen is carried by this molecule to the electron transport chain. Recognize that word? Again, pretty similar to photosynthesis, but the opposite. So these electrons bounce through the electron transport chain on this inner membrane of the mitochondria, and through all this bouncing and movement, that energy, that kinetic energy, is used to put a 3rd phosphate onto an ATP molecule. I think I've got another animation. I do. Okay. So normally what's hanging out in your cells is ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with only 2 phosphate groups. What the energy from this electron transport chain is used to do is to stick this 3rd phosphate group onto ADP to get a TP, triphosphate. That is an extremely powerful process. Out of this, we get 36 ATP. Some textbooks claim 38. It's kind of hard to measure, so we're still working on fine-tuning that. After this, the hydrogen from the food molecule glucose, it's no longer needed, so it gets kicked out and it's combined with oxygen here from your bloodstream, which came in through your lungs. So that oxygen, it accepts these electrons after they come out of the electron transport chain. They're carried again, like I said, by hydrogen. So you get oxygen and hydrogen, and that forms water. So oxygen is absolutely vital to your survival. You know this, but it has what would sound like a really mundane role. It just catches the electrons after the electron transport chain. But without that, you can't have this electron transport chain and you can't have those 36 ATP molecules. So it's very important to have that oxygen. And it's just to accept electrons, but like I said, that's very necessary. So again, just to reiterate, these atoms brought into the cell, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and glucose, they all leave the cell. So carbon and oxygen here is CO2, carbon dioxide. The hydrogen is combined with oxygen that you breathe in to form water, and that all leaves the cell. It leaves your body. The real power of all of this isn't in collecting those atoms or that matter, it's to bounce those electrons around and harness that kinetic energy to produce ATP, which is a more useful molecule for powering cellular functions. If you don't have oxygen, you can't do the electron transport chain, so that's when fermentation kicks in, or anaerobic respiration. Your book talks about it. I find it a little bit less interesting. But having the ability to do this electron transport, requiring oxygen, being able to use oxygen to accept electrons, gives us a huge benefit. With all this ATP from aerobic respiration, we're able to do things which require a lot more energy. Things like being multicellular, that in itself requires a lot of energy because cells are able to specialize and do one job. We can also chase antelope across a field or whatever. Plants do this too. Never forget that. Plants also have to go through aerobic respiration. They have mitochondria. They have a very energy-rich functions, like growing all this fruit around a seed, like think of an apple. That's full of energy and the plant doesn't use it. It's used to bribe animals to come and take that seed away from that tree and deposit it through what they've eaten into this nice little batch of fertilizer. Kind of gross, but it gives a huge benefit to that apple tree. And so they expend a huge amount of energy to entice primates and ungulates, deer, and things to take the fruit and take it away from the tree so that it can grow. So we use oxygen to get all that energy. I will probably never stop talking about the importance of carbon. So remember that carbon is cycled between the atmosphere and the biosphere through these two reactions, photosynthesis and respiration. And then, like we talked about in the last video in 4.1, during some processes that are actually geologically pretty rare, this carbon can get stored into the lithosphere. Remember, that's the rock. Can get stored and trapped as fossil fuels for hundreds of millions of years. So if we upset this cycle, this balance of carbon entering and exiting the atmosphere by things like burning these fossil fuels to release huge amounts of carbon dioxide, or by clear-cutting forests so that this carbon in living plants leaves and then less carbon is being fixed because there are fewer photosynthesizers, those can have catastrophic effects on our climate. But there are some less doomy things to talk about here too, which are pretty cool. So the carbon and matter that enters our body comes from food, right? You have no problem with that, I hope. Ignore the oxygen for now. No one cares about that anymore. So a lot of that matter from our food is stored as fat. When you go to lose weight, you're breaking that fat down, you're changing it into glucose, aerobically respiring it to get those electrons, right? And then it's released out of our bodies as carbon dioxide, which maybe you haven't thought about it, but it's really cool. This means when you lose weight, you're breathing it out. It's kind of neat. Sure, like a bunch of water leaves your body through urination, defecation, perspiration, sweating. But the main mass, the carbon and the oxygen, they leave your body through your lungs, through your breath. And then that same carbon dioxide, now it's in the atmosphere because we breathed it out. It gets fixed by the plants. And so think of like a giant redwood, that trunk, that tons and tons and tons of cellular structure is from the air. And it's pretty neat to think about. There's a really funny video that circulates around the internet every once in a while where they asked Harvard graduates on graduation day, one of the best schools in the world, they asked them, they're carrying around a chunk of wood, and they asked these Harvard graduates where the mass in that wood came from, and they're saying things like, oh, like the water that the roots brought up made cell wall somehow with no carbon in it, who knows. nutrients in the dirt, or they think that plants just kind of suck up soil, they suck up dirt and make cell structures out of it. But no, all of that's wrong, okay? It comes from the air. This stuff that you don't think of as tangible is extremely tangible, and if you have the ability to do photosynthesis, you can fix it into glucose and do all these cool things with it. And then some animal comes along and eats that plant, and now they turn it into fat and then later breathe it out. It's a really fun cycle. Okay, but we gotta go. So, to summarize, remember that we get our energy from our food. That's not a good color anymore. So, the source of our dietary energy comes from the macronutrients in our food. Specifically, it's a series of chemical reactions that break down that food to get ATP. I forgot to mention, I just remembered, fats, lipids, have so much energy in them, so many calories, because they have these chains of carbon and hydrogen, these fatty acid tails. Look at it in your book, it shows you. And those are very rich in electrons. So lipids have way more electrons than carbohydrate or a protein has, and so they're able to bounce more electrons down the electron transport chain and give you more ATP out of that. That's why. And then also remember this cycle. I call it the carbon cycle, just because I think that's the atom that is the one to follow through that cycle. But this photosynthesis and respiration form this very, very important cycle. That cycle is pretty vital to many global systems, so messing with it can be a bad idea. That's all going to come back in Unit 4. At this point, you have all the information you need to take the Lecture 4 quiz. I would do that right away. And then start working on your Unit 1 assessment. This is a paper, not just a list of multiple choice and short answer questions. So you're not going to sit down Sunday night and do it. It will not work. You're going to need a few days, I would recommend, or at least a full couple days. I would recommend writing a draft and having someone else read it, and that takes time, so don't wait. You'll also have a discussion this week. It's not one that requires any research or anything. You're sharing what you learned through this unit, so not too bad. But same rules, post by Friday now is how I've made it, and then respond to someone else by Sunday. You do not have any other lab or assignment other than your Unit 1 assessment. As always, ask me questions. I'll be around, and have a fantastic week.